So we are here in Logan County, Kentucky with Tommy Hines, the Executive Director of South Union Shaker Village.
Correct.
And how are you today?
Doing great.
Good.
Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And I'd like to start off, let you tell me a little bit about your connection to Kentucky to start with.
Okay. Well, I was born in Kentucky. My family has been here in this part of the state since about 1805. Came from Virginia. Migrated from Virginia like a lot of people did in those days. So we've got a long history here in southern Kentucky.
Yeah. And you still live here in the area. I know you said you live in a house that's got the Hines name attached to it.
Yes, it's about circa 1842 house in Woodbury, Kentucky on the Green River.
Yeah.
That has a lot of Hines history.
That's really cool.
Associated with it, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So we're here at South Union, obviously, in the Shaker Village, and you've been here for quite a while.
I hate to tell you, yeah. I got out of graduate school in 1986 and got this job that very next summer.
Yeah.
So I've been here in some capacity ever since.
So
long time,
but that's good. That's good. It means you got a lot of history with.
Well, I like what I do.
Yeah, that's good. So let's talk a little bit about the Shakers and specifically this village. But where did the Shakers get their start with that movement?
Well, they started originally in England and came to America 250 years ago this year, 1774. And they settled in upstate New York and then just began to grow and establish communal villages in New York and in New England. In 1805, they sent missionaries to the West, which was in those days, because of the Great Awakening, the great religious revivals that were going on here at the time.
Right.
So they left January 1st, 1805, and the men arrived here in this part of the world several months later and eventually established 4 villages in Ohio, 2 in Kentucky, and 1 in Indiana.
Okay. So and this one came in 1807.
This was 1807.
1807, so it was a little later than the other Kentucky.
Pleasant Hill, 1805. We came along in 1807.
Okay, yeah. And then it was here basically till the early 1900s?
Yes, it lasted until 1922, and it was the last of all those western villages to close. I don't know, they were stubborn here and did not want to give up, but the community had dwindled to only about 50 people by 1900, and then by 1922 only 9 people were here, and there were several thousand acres in the farm and a lot of old buildings, many which I'm sure needed repair even at that point. And they weren't increasing, they weren't drawing new members, so the Shakers in New York said it's time to go, more or less. So they had a big auction here, and everything was closed.
Okay, yeah. And I know they had those last 9 had a couple of options, right? For what I think we're getting a little ahead of ourselves with this.
No, they did.
We can talk about, because I'd like to talk about what's going on here now.
Yeah, those last 9. It's very interesting that after all the hundreds upon hundreds of people who had been here over the years, those 9 folks survived to the very end. Some of them had been here for decades. Some of them had only been here for several years. So ironically, they are given the choice of either joining the village at Mount Lebanon, New York, taking the train to New York, or taking a check for $10,000, which was pretty much of an absolute fortune in 1922. So 7 took the money, 2 of them took the train to New York. And the odd thing about it is that just a few months later, 2 of the 7 that left married one another. A man and a woman in their 50s. They had $20,000 between them.
That's a pretty good amount of money for...
It was a good bankroll for 1922, and they bought a beautiful house in Auburn, right up the road, and bought, as we can tell from history, they bought new furniture, because some of that has come back to us. So they bought new, Sears and Roebuck round oak table and bentwood chairs, just like everybody else in 1922, and didn't seem to have a terrible amount of Shaker furniture at the time of their auction, which came many years later. But they wanted the new stuff. They were truly starting over, but they were in their 50s and only lived, within probably 10, 12 years longer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's no like modern descendants now of any
No,
of those folks?
there
They were
are
all-
none. We have a lot of people who are descendants
Yeah.
because obviously not everybody stayed here. So you could be a
Right.
Shaker for 40 years, you could leave and, get married or whatever. But just last week, we had a family come to visit because we found a pair of pants in the attic that has the initials WS on them. They are circa 1840s, 50s pants, and they're for a pretty small youth. So
Okay.
we canvassed the census records when we found those pants, and you could tell who it was. It was a young man named Whitfield Stevenson.
Okay.
Well, Whitfield eventually left here and had children, and some of his family came back to see those pants.
Yeah.
We had done an article about it in our newsletter. So
That's really
it's about the third or fourth trip that family has made, different people and kids coming to
Yeah.
see those old pants. And they were, pretty well chewed up by vermin and insects over the years. They had fallen down in the floor below an attic. And so we had a very young intern who was small enough to be able to slide down in
get
there
down in
and
there.
get them. Yeah, if it were up to me, I would have never gotten them out. But he rescued those pants, and it's become a really interesting, story
Yeah.
with family connections.
That's really cool, though. I mean, that's such a big reason to do. I mean, obviously preserving the posterity of this, but also those familial connections.
Yeah.
For people
Yeah.
to have that. Do you get a lot of other people that travel here that have stories, or at least know like descendants?
All the time. And I'll tell you the difference is that, most places, if your family was from Bowling Green, for instance, you might be able to search deed records, you might be able to search newspapers.com, you might be able to search census, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Here, we've got daily journals, and you might be able to find out what your great grandfather was eating for breakfast in 1845,
Really?
and where he was working, if he decided to leave, why he left. So there's all these little intricate details about literally hundreds of people who were coming and going here.
That's incredible. So they had daily records of almost.
Well, from 1807 all the way up until 1922, we've got record. There are gaps,
Right.
and there are always things you will wish that they had been in a little more detail about. But so we can pull out information that you would not be able to find anywhere else if your family happened to be
If they had
associated.
connections here. Mm-hmm. Well, and I saw some of the things walking through the center house where you had little excerpts from things with people having left, or just little notes from daily life and stuff like that. And I think that's really an interesting way. I don't have a personal connection here, but it gives me a little bit of this is how life was. And it seems like they weren't written. I mean, they're written to document, but there were definitely some editorial bits, it seemed like, in there, like Poor Willie or something like that.
There are, those folks were human too. And one of the journal keepers that we had was one of the elders here, and he is very vocal and occasionally a little bit cynical.
Yeah.
He'll say something about especially when people leave. If you've invested maybe 2 decades in some young people that were here, and they had seemed to bought into the idea of becoming Shakers their entire life, and then they up and leave, you're disappointed, but you're a little angry at all of that. And so you'll see little cynical comments about that every once in a while. So, they were humans, and you can tell they're humans by looking at these records.
Yeah.
Now, for years, here we talked about things like furniture and baskets and candle dipping and all those kind of things that people associate with the Shakers. But in the past decade or so, we have been much more aware of stories and the people that lived here. And it's almost a never-ending thing because, again, there were so many people in and out of here. And we try to do a biography every time we do a newsletter. And it's never difficult to do. You can just kind of trace when they come and when they leave, or if they end up living here their entire life. And there's usually some pretty cool little tidbits of personal stuff there.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, like how when you leave, because when you came here, everything you had became a. Explain that because I'm not going to do a good job of it, but joining and maybe this is a good time too. Shaker isn't the official term, right?
No, they're called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing.
Okay, but we say Shakers.
We say Shakers because that was a derogatory term originally that people made fun of them because of the way they worshipped.
Right.
They had what they call laboring, or they marched in their worship. So, but they accepted it, and it became what they put on their products too,
right.
and it became recognizable. But yeah, so
yeah. Well, it's just where was I going with that though? Because I brought that up to say, about the products though too. We can go into that. I know that's you talking about the furniture and everything else, and that's kind of what people associate, I think, sometimes with.
Yeah, they do, and they made tons of furniture here because you had probably about 150 bedrooms here in the entire village, let's say, and anywhere from 2 to 3 beds per room. That really adds up.
Right.
When you have to produce that much furniture. They did not sell furniture, and most Shaker villages did not. They did in Mount Lebanon. They had a chair factory in New York, but most Shaker villages were making furniture for the community,
for their own use. Okay.
But they had industries where they were making all sorts of things to be sent out to the market, from baskets and hats and bonnets and simple things like that. But they were also heavily into the purebred cattle industry.
Oh, I didn't know
along
that.
with Pleasant Hill. South Union and Pleasant Hill worked together there. They had a silk industry here and made silk kerchiefs and silk thread and silk cloth, very unique for Kentucky at that time. They had a fruit preserve industry here. They made Shaker brooms, and they were very serious about their marketing and made tons of money.
Yeah.
You can't build buildings like you see at Pleasant Hill or like you see at South
Right.
Union without some sort of capital behind.
I was going to say that center house alone is just massive. How many rooms is that?
There's 24 bedrooms in the house, plus you've got dining rooms, kitchens, multiple kitchens, storage rooms, what they call clothes rooms or closets, meeting room. So it's a big place, 15,000 square feet, I think.
Okay, yeah. I was going to say it's in 4 stories, and it feels like it keeps going and going and going, but it's really an incredible bit of workmanship that goes into that.
A lot of detail.
Yeah. So back to the question I was asking earlier was about people giving everything up when they came here.
Yes. Early on, you had people that were joining with their entire family. So a husband, wife, children, entire nuclear family is joining. And most often, people in that situation had earthly belongings. Some of them had land, and some of them gave the land where we're sitting right now that was the nucleus of this village. And it seems, kind of hard for us to understand today why an entire family would want to join, and mom and dad, separate, and kids brought up in what they called a children's order, completely separate sometimes from their parents. But, the people that were joining here in the early days were very serious about religious life. And they saw that, this was kind of the millennium. This was the last vestige of what was going on here. And they were preparing for that. And they thought that was the way that they could do it. Now, as time goes on, you see fewer and fewer families joining. You see more and more single people or single parents with housefuls of children in tow.
Right.
So in that situation, you are providing, a single mother, for instance, a place for her children where you get 3 hot meals a day, you got great education, you get taught a trade here. And so they're raised in community, and then once they're 18, they can, choose to stay or leave. So you see more and more of that type of a situation. And often, too, as time goes by, you see people bringing in less. The earlier ones were bringing in these farms and this capital and all this stuff. But as time goes on, somebody might show up with a suitcase.
Yeah.
And I don't think the Shakers really distinguished that they look what they brought and look what they brought, and they get to live in a better place.
Right.
But you don't see that much. But it was communal, and so everything was supposed to be shared alike. But occasionally we do find Whitfield Stevenson's name in his pants.
Right.
You do see people's initials in their collar or things like that. So the human, I think, seems to want to have something of its own,
right,
to gather things up. And even though it was communal, you do see some things like that. You see some locks on drawers and things of that sort.
Well, I thought it was interesting going by, what was it called, the deacon's closet,
Mm-hmm.
and so you had one person who kind of doled out, was it everything or like all the?
It was your household needs.
Your house.
So your sheets and your towels, your lamp oil, candles, brooms, whatever else you needed, the literature they thought you needed for your space. And the deacons took care of the men in the house. The deaconesses took care of the women's, what they would say, temporal needs.
Okay.
Every day.
And they all lived in the same building but separated, right?
They're all
The men and
together,
women.
but the hallway down the middle is the separation of the men.
Because I think it's neat. You've got the twin staircases and everything to keep everybody right. Was that for the men used one side, the women used?
It is. And here's another thing too. From an architectural standpoint, you get perfect symmetry.
Yeah.
Well, that's not only a reality as far as the way they live, but it's also symbolic because they believe that men and women were equal.
Mm-hmm.
So the women's rooms are not smaller than the men's. The built-in cupboards are mirror images of what you get on either side. So everybody is getting everything alike. Every one of the dwelling houses had a male and a female that oversaw the house.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've talked about the deacon and deaconesses who are giving you the things that you need to live. And then the entire community is led by an elder and an eldress that oversees the whole shebang.
Yeah. Hold this a second. I just want to make sure this is running right.
All right.
And then I'll pop right back. I always do this because I want to make sure it is. Yeah, okay. That was a good place. I can edit that out real quick.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think it's interesting. And I know you've got a display up there about women specifically and their roles here, and that their roles were not, some women had roles that I guess we might term traditionally feminine roles, but they could have done anything within the community, right?
They did, and they rose to levels that you might not see in the outside world. The one we always go to is the woman who became what they called their physician. And for 40 years, she oversaw the medical department here. She lived in the center house. And we don't know how she was trained necessarily, but we do have books, leather-bound books from the 1840s and 50s that talk about diseases and talk about surgery and all those kinds of things that was self-taught. But it wasn't all just, herbs and rubbing two sticks together. It was, they were really seriously trying to learn the best way that they could. So yeah, a woman was the main physician here for many years.
I mean, that would have been very unusual in the 19th century, right?
It is unusual. They're leading industries. The women led their own industries, and they weren't just the worker bees. They were the ones that were in charge of the money, the finances, all the administration. And if you want to get into equality even more, the Shakers believed in racial equality, and so they had black and white members who lived side by side in these buildings by 1820. They integrated in 1820.
Okay.
Prior to 1820, they had the African Americans separate.
Okay.
Because this was such a difficult place to integrate when you had slaveholders joining the Shakers and former slaves who were Shakers, and it was very difficult. But the Shakers made the important stance in 1820 to integrate all the buildings.
So like up in New York, they may have already been integrated, but here it was a little later, or was that sort of a global thing within?
Well, I don't think any village had as many people of color as we did, or possibly Pleasant Hill, and it's all because of where we're located.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because many times a slaveholder would join the Shakers, but if he did, he had to immediately set those enslaved free. Just within the confines of the village, because there's no way you could have set someone free outside of the village.
So
they would have been against the law. But eventually, the Shakers signed manumission papers for many of the people of color that were here, and they could leave if they wanted to and be free if they could do so safely.
Right.
This is before 1865.
Right.
If they could, and some of them unfortunately did not get away safely, but some of them did and made it somewhere else. Because just because you came here with your slaveholder and you got freedom here, it didn't mean you wanted to be a Shaker.
Right. Now,
so you were still, in a way, being held at a place that you might not have wanted to be.
Right.
But there were, in particular, African American women here who became very involved and lived their entire lives here, and did reach some of those same types of leadership roles that we talked about before.
And there were some, if I understood it right, there were some free blacks that had come here of their own volition, or did everybody come here?
Yes, there are some examples of some free blacks that were here, but the large number at the very beginning of this place was because of slaveholders. Yeah.
That's it's really interesting, because I think a lot of times we think of the Shakers and we think of this sort of old-fashioned way and but they were very progressive in some of their, I don't know if politics would be the right word, but of their views of
socially, that's
a better way to put it.
They're very progressive, and again, you're right. People look at the Shakers and they look at the little white bonnets, and they looked at them as being a throwback, but they were a real force for change. Unfortunately, as we always say here, their voice was just too small.
Right.
And people weren't really paying attention to that fact. People could not stop thinking about how strange they worshiped and how strange it was that they didn't marry. So the curiosity was more what drew people to the Shakers. It wasn't like, oh, they're progressive, we ought to be thinking about being that same way. I'm proud of the fact that the Shakers were doing those things so early in our history, but unfortunately, it didn't rub off.
Right.
On a national standpoint.
Well, and things like having their views of chastity the way they did, kind of, I'm sure that hinders your growth a little bit if you don't have an internal growth.
It does, and what we say though is that the Shakers, they're established in 1774 in America. It grew and it grew annually, and there was no decline for a long time, and it begins to decline after the first third of part of the 19th century to some degree.
Okay.
But there were ups and downs, and until the mid-Victorian period, you don't start to see serious decline. But our neighbors over here, the Fathers of Mercy, nobody talks about their decline. They're an order of priests.
Right.
And,
yeah.
Nobody mentions that, and nobody, when they come to visit the priests, they don't say to them, well, no wonder you all died out. So we're always trying to make that point with people, because we hear it every day. And it's if the Shakers, it's as if people in 2024 have figured it out, but the Shakers were too dumb to notice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So what has happened is it was an economic thing. It was a social change thing. When people no longer were so dependent upon community, and when the railroad came through here in 1860, and you could be in Nashville in 3 hours,
right?
And you're 18 years old, and you think, I don't have to stay here, and you could be in Louisville a little bit longer than that. And it wasn't just happening in Shaker villages; it happened everywhere. That's what happened to rural America as people started moving to cities. And when you lose your young people and your workforce in a community that is solely based, as far as their money on those industries. So industries start to die when your workforce starts to go away, and then as you're aging, you're not able to do as much. So it just wasn't as appealing to a younger audience, I think, by the Victorian time. Now, they might discard that in New England, where some of the Shaker villages there were viable up into the mid 20th century to some degree, and there's still a Sabbath Day Lake now where we draw a lot of our inspiration. The folks, the tiny band that is still there, still living that lifestyle that they were living here in 1807. It's just crazy.
I think that's really interesting. I don't think probably a lot of people know that this is still an ongoing thing. It's not we're looking at a very static time frame, and then that was it.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the postage stamps that have come out.
I did. That's amazing.
So the U.S. Postal Service is commemorating 250 years of Shakers, and it's not just like, well, that's when they started. No, it's still a remnant of what was begun there 250 years ago. It's the only communal experiment in America that's lasted this long, and there were lots of them. There were quite a few at one time. So
that's fascinating, and I'm glad you could clear up a little bit about that, because I know that's sort of one of the things that people think is that, well, they weren't. If you're not making more Shakers, then But to your point, and that makes a lot of sense, that like that sort of moving to a more urban-centered lifestyle, I think, for a lot of people, and so it makes sense that people weren't gravitating to this like they were at the earlier part.
Yeah, and a lot of people, even in the 20th century America, were so, and I know where I'm from, this is the case, so they were dependent upon their church for community. Mm-hmm. Maybe a community center of some kind, or a store, but that little community was where everything took place. All the social aspects were drawn to that one place, and as the world grows, those little places aren't as important anymore, and those little churches sit empty today, or those old stores are long closed. And we just, time, as they say, marches on, and life changes, and the Shakers were caught up in that, just like everybody else. And I'll say this too, that people who have nuclear families, you can bring your children up in the church as a Methodist or whatever, today. That doesn't guarantee that's where they're going to be later in life. You hope so. You want to guide your children in the way that in your philosophy, in the way of thinking, but it's not a guarantee. So, the Shakers had hoped to continue that too, but it didn't quite work out as successfully as they had hoped. But I don't negate the progressiveness and the charity and the goodness that they have brought to the world, really, over the past 200 years. It's not dead.
No,
by any means.
Well, and I think that one of the things that is very much alive is that idea that people are drawn to the simplicity, I guess is the word that a lot of people use, and I think that might be I hate to say it, an oversimplification, but it was a very modest.
It was
life, and I think a lot of people. I talk to people that have visited here, and they always say the same thing about how peaceful it seems. Mm-hmm. But then you think, well, it was a bustling community, though. But there was certainly. Do you think there was an undercurrent of still peacefulness, even though there was this very kind of industrious?
I think in some ways it's all a matter of perspective. I know there's a famous quote from someone who visited a Shaker village in New York back in the 19th century, and he said even the dust in the road seemed pure. They have some sort of an aura about them. But I can tell you, in the center house, for instance, if you had 100 people walking around on wooden floors, it's anything but quiet. You're hearing the kitchen noises and having kitchen smells pretty much all day long, every day. You're actually audibly, you're hearing the factories that are just over on the creek here, mm-hmm. because all that water-powered machinery that they had, and steam power after that, makes noise, and it makes loud noise.
Right.
And then the highway here, it was not a little back road. This was what they called the Great Road, 6880, which is the same road that used to run through Pleasant Hill, was a major thoroughfare.
Right.
And they built that because they needed the customer base, to come through. So, it's hard to know. I'd love to go back to 1840 and just see what it was actually like. But I have a sense that there was a modicum of peace for sure because of the way that they thought, their philosophy in this environment. But there were still 19th century noises that would probably surprise us.
Yeah, and probably some smells and sights and things
Definitely
too.
some smells. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
It's a whole different way of living. Yeah. I have a hard time conveying to school children, about the mundane things of bathing and bathroom habits of those days are so completely different than what we're used to today. So it looks, if you walk through the center house, it looks a lot prettier, I would say, than it might have, if you walk through in 1840. There were some things that might not have been as pleasing.
Right, right. Well, I want to go back to the industry thing because I think that, and I just want to ask you this. I mean, they were not anti-industry or technology. I mean, they definitely were embracing that, right? That was not something. They were. Because I think sometimes people, I won't say confuse it, but they think, oh, it's kind of like maybe like how Amish folk or something. And yes, it is a religious community but they were embracing a lot of those things and in some cases inventing it, right?
They did. And so they are not really associated with the Amish in the least, but we get that question almost every day as well. The bonnet, that pesky bonnet, that tips people off and makes them think, but no, they couldn't.
And that's why I hesitated to even say it because I was like, I don't want to conflate the two, but I know that people do.
They ask all the time, and it couldn't be farther from the truth because of their progressive stance on technology. And you can see right from the very beginning, they are buying the best of farm equipment. They're constantly renewing the stoves and their way of cooking in the kitchens here, the way to heat the buildings. They're upgrading all the time. And they did invent, and many people say they didn't patent, but they did have some patents. We had some here in this community. So they were good capitalists. You had to make money to operate a farm of 6,000 acres. That wasn't all just sitting there. They were using it all for something. And for 400 people, let's say, to operate a farm of 6,000 acres still took a lot of time and effort. So those industries were important. Early on, they were going down the Mississippi River on a flatboat and stopping at all the little ports, selling things all the way to New Orleans. And then eventually they would, once steamboats came in, they were able to do that via steamboat. And then, of course, when the railroad comes in, they can do it by rail, which made it even much easier. But they also took wagons to Nashville, peddling to Nashville, department stores and things of that sort.
Yeah, that's just, I mean, it's incredible to me to see all these buildings and how they were, so many of them were dedicated to some sort of industry or some sort of, but not just for, as you say, internal use.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and something else that was interesting to me going through was you've got a whole display on See, now I got my own brain messed up there on Shaker colors.
Yes.
And some colors, and I think that not a lot of people would really associate those two things together for whatever reason. I don't know if we just have in our head that in this quest for simplicity that I think we somewhat invented, that it was also a colorless world, but it seems like it was quite the opposite.
Yeah, and I think, just to be fair, I think the 19th century in general, interiors were much more colorful than we know. Things got painted over in later years, but the Shakers did embrace that color, and we have only discovered that in the past decade or so. We have sent samples to Susan Buck, who works in Colonial Williamsburg, and she does this microscopic look and can not only tell you what every layer of color from the wood to the very top latex, if it happened to be overpainted, but she can tell you what the paint was made of.
Wow.
So we get the chemical aspect of it, and we've discovered that the Shakers were making their own paints, and they were buying pigments in Bowling Green, and then grinding flaxseed to make the linseed oil, and mixing that up and making this oil paint. I think every paint she's analyzed for us has been that same formula. But the color that we have discovered, it continues to be shocking to us. Old paint, on woodwork, when we've got some, you can see there's old surfaces over there too. They darken with age. You get dirt, you get layers of varnish and layers of wax and everything else on that, and they get dark and muddled. But when you can really see what those colors look like, it's amazing to me. And now there were the village at Whitewater, Ohio, they have discovered some beautiful colors there as well. But there's something about South Union's variety and the way they use colors together, which is kind of unique, at least in the Shaker West.
Yeah,
I think. But it's a really cool thing, and we're still learning. And so we've got other samples that we want to send to her because we've got some other projects we want to do.
Yeah. Well, that's something, I think it's neat too, because you all aren't just like, okay, here's what we got. I mean, this is an ongoing thing, and I feel like every time I come, there's a new room opened up, or maybe you've taken a room and you're reimagining how you're telling that story, and I know that's an ongoing concern here as well.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that, because we do really make attempts to change things around often, so you can't say, well, I was there 10 years ago, I don't want to come back. There's something new to see. But yeah, we continue to do research, we continue to do things like this paint analysis. We're in the process now of restoring the wash house, the sister shop that was built in 1854, the big 3-story brick building on the other side of the center house that we've only owned 5 years. And we've just gotten a very significant contribution from a private individual to restore all 3 of the main level rooms. And we're in the process now we're actually waiting for the reproduction doors and transoms and panel jambs to come to us. We had them made down in near Franklin, Tennessee. Okay. And we only had one intact door with jamb and the door still on its hinges, and it had been kind of encapsulated behind 1970s paneling on both sides. And when we ripped the paneling off the wall, there was that fantastic door still on its original hinges. So from that, we've been able to that's our template for all the restoration.
Well, that's amazing, yeah.
So we're making some good inroads in that restoration project too, and there's other good stuff coming up too.
Well, that's great. Yeah, no, and that's what I mean. I'm probably over here at least once a year. I mean, I'll drive through more often than that because it's right in my backyard. But like I said, every time I feel like there's something new, and it's great to see that ongoing thing. Another thing I love too is that you've got the bedroom that people can actually go in and get their hands on things.
Yes, people tend to love that. And go through all the drawers and open the cupboards, and I think they sit on the beds and the rocking chairs. None of that is original furniture. It's all either reproduction or period stuff that we don't mind, people are using. But yeah, people do. They want to.
Well, I think just to feel the bedding and to feel the way that it would have been. I mean, it's such a great way to say, okay, I have a better understanding now of how things would have been, and I think that's really neat that you guys are doing that. So, and now tell me a little more. You said that you're restoring this other building, and I know that historic restoration is kind of another part of your passion. How did you get into that?
Well, that's what my actual degree was in. And when I came here, I had just finished my master's in historic preservation at Western. So I really didn't know much about the Shakers necessarily, but I was here because there were restoration needs at that point. And they had done a lot. And I never want to look at the past and say, you didn't do this right or you didn't finish this. They had made huge inroads from when they bought these buildings in 72. So when I came in 86, I start thinking, well, this also needs to be done. And we've added more land, we've added more buildings since that time too. And then the Shaker history just sort of, I don't know, it just sort of envelops you. And so it's a nice thing to be able to work in historic preservation where you actually care about what took place there and you understand what took place. in these buildings. And this wash house is just going to be a fabulous addition for us because it is also 15,000 square feet. So we've got this great space now that we're going to be able to use for children's tours. We're going to be able to have galleries with changing exhibits. We're going to do some period space in there. Our collection storage will also be in there.
Okay.
In one central location, finally, after
Yeah.
all these years. We think our library will probably move over there too. So we'll have, we hope, if our grant money works out, we hope to be able to have accessibility on all floors.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Yeah.
And restrooms, but separate from the old building. And the old building is going to be restored to look as much like 1854 as it can with all the modern amenities.
And that's, how many buildings? There's 9 buildings here
There's
now?
9 buildings left here out of 220 something that the Shakers.
That's incredible. I mean, it's incredible to think how many they built in a fairly short amount of time. I mean, early on.
And they
But
weren't
then-
all like center houses, you know.
Right.
Some of them were outhouses and sheds and
Yeah.
little barns and stables and carriage houses and all that kind of thing too. But there were big, significant buildings that were torn down. 50 buildings still standing in 1922.
Okay.
50.
Yeah.
So that's more than any of a Shaker village would have had at that time in the West.
Yeah.
But the new owner chose to tear down everything except for the 9 that he had a very specific use for.
Okay. I wondered how he picked I had seen that he had done that because that was, was it then or was it later that there was the big auction that everybody came to?
No, it was in 22. And then
Okay.
at that very final auction in September of 22 is when he took possession of the village itself. Now, most of the other part of the farm was broken up into smaller farms, but the village itself is mostly what he took possession of. So he didn't need the buildings and just began to tear them down.
That's such a...
Yeah, it's a terrible shame. And when you walk through a building like the Center House and you look at that architecture and you look at those beautiful wooden details that took them so much time to do, and you think, in a cavalier way, those things were just wiped away. Buildings bigger than the Center House
Really?
were torn down.
I mean, it's hard to imagine what would have been here bigger than that. Just because that feels like such a central place. I mean, it feels like
and it was probably the finest building. It was where there was a bit of a hierarchy here. The longer you were here, the more dedicated you were. You signed the covenant. You moved into the Center House, and it was probably the best as far as detail is concerned. But it wasn't the biggest. The East House had an extra floor on it. It was taller.
Yeah. No, you talk about the details, and I was looking at someone I was over there, and like you've got something pointing out the chute, the rope comes down in the kitchen area to ring the bell, and I just thought, I mean, even that little thing was just so perfectly made, it seemed like, but also that somebody thought, oh yeah, we're gonna have to ring the bell to let people know. Yeah.
The bell sold at auction in 1922, and we know where it is today.
Oh yeah.
But we can't get it back.
Yeah.
We'd love to have it back, but I'm not sure we'd put it back up in the bell tower. It weighs 1,000 pounds or more.
Right.
But it was sent here as a gift in 1844. Our elder here at South Union went back to the Northeast to live out the rest of his life, and he sent that as a gift. He stopped in Cincinnati on the way, so the bell was made in Cincinnati, and it's inscribed from him to the Shakers here at South Union. So this beautiful inscription on this massive brass bell, and they built that bell tower just for that bell.
Just for that. Mm-hmm. So now, when was the Center House built?
The Center House was finished in 1833, so about 10 years later is when the bell came.
When they added
so that chute, that bell rope chute was a retrofit. It came after the fact.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But that's another testament to they adapted. They kept changing as it wasn't just like we did this one time. And I mean, reading about them laying the concrete down or the cement down in that basement where the oak planks were.
Yeah, and I kind of wish they hadn't have done it, but I'd much rather have nice white oak floors in those kitchens and dining rooms than poured concrete, but they saw a need to do it because they were having termite issues.
Oh, okay. I was wondering what. Yeah.
That's what they did, and they also put in that hot water radiator system that we still use today to heat the building, and they put that in about the year or just maybe less than a year before they left. So I don't really think they had any inkling that they were going to have to leave, because they were still improving in 1921.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to point that out too, because with that floor, because I thought, people might not realize they did that. And you guys do a good job pointing it out, but that was a practical concern, and for them, it probably made more sense. So let's go this direction with it. Even though, as you say, I bet that oak floor was gorgeous.
Yeah, I'd love to walk down in that kitchen on an oak floor instead of concrete, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Now, as a retired chef, I'm like, ooh, that concrete's probably easier to keep clean.
It is, and we don't have to worry about termites in the floor. And speaking of being a chef, we're getting ready to rebuild the brick and iron range back.
Oh, okay.
That was under one of the arches in the kitchen.
That's kind of, if you come in that main entrance, kind of over to the right.
Yes,
yeah.
You see these holes in the wall. So we don't have any photographs of it, but we have verbal descriptions. And it had a brick front and an iron top, and kettles sunk down in it, and plates or lids like a cast iron stove.
Yeah.
And there were 3 different chambers that you could fire. You didn't have to fire it all together.
Oh, okay.
And then it has actually a vent that's still there over the top that draws out the steam and the smoke into the chimney, just kind of like you turn on your oven vent.
Yeah.
Today, except it works all the time.
Well, I think it's neat, all those little things that they had too. I mean, ways of pulling that off. And what was it? I saw in the one of the rooms, the tan lilies. Is that what it was
Tin
called?
lily.
Tin lily. Sorry, I read it wrong.
Yeah. And those were kerosene fixtures that had tiny little stove pipes that took that smell out of the room.
I mean, that's
that was a Shaker invention.
Yeah.
Too. So yeah. So maybe the next time you come back, you'll be able to see our new range, because we have already employed a blacksmith and a brick mason.
Oh, great!
So it's in the works.
That's coming soon. So. You gonna do any cooking down there, or is it just gonna be
It's all just gonna be for looks.
Just for looks, yeah.
I'm a little bit afraid to light a fire in that
building. Yeah, I don't blame you there. I just didn't know if you...
It'd be fun though.
Yeah. I mean, I can see people being drawn to that.
Yes.
So, what else do we need to talk about Shaker today? I'm trying to. We've talked about a lot of stuff, and I know you've got some improvements coming to the buildings and to the downstairs with the kitchen improvements and
new things to see. Another building that we own, I'll just throw this in too, is the South Union Hotel.
Oh yeah, I meant to ask about that.
And the store building over there. The South Union Hotel was built in 1869, 9 years after the railroad came through, and 4 years after the Civil War ended, and it was all in an attempt to try to make money after the war. And it worked very well for them. They hired an outside innkeeper to come in and live there, and you could walk off the train and wait for the train. There were terminal type rooms, and there was full service kitchen and dining room there, and then some rooms for overnight upstairs. And we own that building. We use it primarily for an event space today, and we have a lot of our meetings and a lot of our historic meals are served there that we do from some of our events. And then the little store across the street, we've got plans for it as well. It was the last major building that the Shakers built. So they were still building in 1917. And it's a brick store building. That's where they had the South Union Post Office and a dry goods general store for the community.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I meant to ask you about that, because I've always heard, I grew up right down the road, and I'd hear about and I always thought it was interesting because people call it the tavern or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, how does that? But it makes a lot more sense now that... Yeah.
The Shakers always ran what they called a tavern here in the village to their trustee's office. The tavern just referred to as a place to eat and spend the night.
Right.
So it was called the trustee's office, just like Pleasant Hill has their trustee's office today where they serve their meals. But you could come and spend the night and buy products and eat good food. There's some really nice references to people coming by and eating. And, Henry Clay dined here. Andrew Jackson, President James Monroe dined here at South Union. Of course, a lot of Civil War generals of note and their armies came through here and ate. So South Union, like most Shaker villages, had a great reputation for good food.
Yeah.
They were known for the food and the amount that they could produce in a short amount of time.
Yeah. You and you said you still do some meals here or over at that building, like.
We do. We have a series of farm-to-table meals every year, and we usually do one in the old grain barn down the lane here, and the rest of them are all at the hotel.
Okay.
Because we do some in the wintertime.
Yeah.
And it still makes a really beautiful place to dine.
Yeah.
The one at Christmas that we do in December is by candlelight, and it's probably my favorite because we decorate the mantles. We have some wonderful volunteer that does that for us, and it's a really nice event.
Would they have decorated and done all that for Christmas?
They
here
didn't
as
do
much?
much here, but we know they had a tree here, and we
Okay.
have pictures of some other Shaker villages. We don't have pictures. They didn't do a lot, but they did do a Christmas tree. They exchanged gifts.
Okay.
That was mostly 20th century, though. There's not much in the 19th century like that happening.
Yeah.
They would gather to eat and do nice things for people, but not like we're used to today.
Right.
Not like we envision today.
Yeah, I think people envision some of the older days, and it wasn't as elaborate as I think people think it was, because people wouldn't have had the money to do some of that.
Those holiday traditions that we know, the trees and all the decorations and all that goes along with that, you're talking mainly about late Victorian into the 20th century when those things really started to ramp up. But early 19th century, you don't see any of that
Right.
at all.
Yeah. Well, I love that we can talk about this and kind of dispel some of these myths today too, and not just talk about the facts, but also there's things that people I think just misunderstand about history in general, but especially here with some of the things that have.
Yes. And I don't know if you want to close with this or not, or
Sure.
but
Whatever.
the whole celibacy angle.
Oh yeah.
We have so many people that visit us today that are come with a wink in their eye and say, well, this happened. People were sneaking around, and that there were indiscretions happening all the time here. Well, and again, I hate to dispel that for people, but it really is not true. Those records that we talked about earlier, those manuscript records, if an impropriety is made known, you better believe they are making note of it. It's not something they're going to slough off and go, well, that's no big deal.
Everybody does it.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a very big deal in a Shaker village. So I know from our records, we know of two instances between 1807 and 1922. Two instances. One where a couple here had a baby. The second where a couple were known to have, I don't know what the 19th century term is, but they were romantic. I'll put
Fair
it
enough.
that
I think
way.
people can understand what
is
you're
that okay?
saying. Yeah.
So those were taken, very seriously, and those are the only two times that it's noted in our records. I think by and large, people that were here because they wanted to be.
Right.
They chose to be. They weren't necessarily coming to meet somebody, although it did happen. I mean, people did come and meet somebody, and often couples would meet here and leave.
Right.
And be married. But as far as disrespecting the community, disrespecting the Shakers as a whole, most people were very, very good about that. And some people took it so seriously that they, lived a celibate life as an adult their entire life. Even if some had been married before or whatever, I mean, that cemetery across the street is filled with 420 people over there.
Right.
That live their life here. And I will say too, the cemetery is no longer there because the new owner did destroy it. But he did not destroy, we don't think, what's underground, because with ground penetrating radar we have found those grave shafts, and we're able to establish the perimeters and tear down barns that had been built over part of the cemetery back in around 2008, 9, 10, right around in that time period. So there's a single marker there, and thanks to the Shakers we have a list of who is there.
So you know,
we know who,
you just don't
we
know
just don't
exactly.
know where.
Right.
Anybody is specifically, but there were, you know, black members and white members buried in the same cemetery there, which you know was not happening in this outlying region. Let me assure you. And oddly enough, there was also a strangers cemetery.
Interesting.
Because if you visited the trustee's office and passed away, you know, they couldn't check your driver's license.
Right.
They might not even know who you are. And so there are instances of people dying here when they would spend the night or come through or whatever, and are buried in what they would call the strangers.
That's interesting.
Cemetery. That's
Now,
probably not a real positive way to
no, well,
close,
I wanted to ask another question though too about that, as far as the hospitality and the, you know, having a place for people to stay. Was there a charge for that? Was that?
Oh, there was. They operated like a hotel.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you had to come in, pay your room and board, I assume, and or room or board. I don't know how
You
that
did, and
worked.
some people would stay days, and you see records, you know, they're here for a week, or some people were just here for overnight and passing through. But yeah, it operated like a old school hotel, or what they would have called their tavern.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. That yeah, I mean, it's just the industry of it all.
It's another way to make money. And they sold their products there. You could buy bolts of silk and bolts of linen and whatever else they might have had. And I'm sure the brooms and the preserves, there was a room, storeroom there where you could buy what you needed.
So you could get a little bit of everything and be on your way. And
Yeah.
and
And hospitality was reserved for that building and the church. That's where outsiders were welcome almost any time. There were some restrictions at church because it got a little unruly.
yeah,
People came and made fun of them, you know, during their worship, and they at some point had to stop having public worship. But people weren't allowed just to walk in these buildings. These were homes.
These
So
were
you had to
homes.
be invited, or it was rare that people would come into these dwelling houses. But the trustee's office, the church, was most always open for the public.
yeah. Well, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, if somebody wants hospitality here, when can they come visit and hang out with you all and learn
Well,
more for themselves?
We're open every day, Tuesday through Saturday from 10 to 4 year round. We're only
Okay.
closed 2 days a week. And our website can give you information about tours, whether it's on an individual basis or a group tour, and about our events and things that we have coming up, like our holiday market at Christmas time. So there's a lot of good information there, and historical information too. If you're interested in learning more about the architecture or the collection, there's some good stuff on the website.
Yeah, I feel like we could be here for another 2 hours just talking about the architecture and stuff.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's definitely more to talk about, but
Yeah.
we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, well, I think this is a good starting point for people to understand, you know, what you're preserving here and what
Yes.
you're unearthing here and what you're learning,
Still.
continuing to learn here. And I think that's what's really interesting about it, is that it's not just sitting still.
No,
Even
we're
though-
we're still evolving as a museum.
Yeah. And I'll be putting links underneath so people can find your website
Okay.
and all that stuff. And yeah, I'd encourage everybody to come out here and check it out. It really is. I mean, I know we kind of said it, but it's such a peaceful place to come. And you can do a self-guided tour too, right? Like
Yes.
walk yourself through.
Which
So-
gives people, you know, an option to stay
Yeah.
as long as they like or as little as they like. I think people generally today like not being followed around. We kind of sense that. So here you watch a video for orientation, you're given a map, and you can explore on your own. It seems to work pretty well.
Yeah. Well, and it's great because there's so much space on the grounds too that you can go into the buildings and explore some. But I like just walking between them and walking down toward, you know, all over this area. And even though the highway runs through, it's not, with the new highway, it's just very quiet.
It
out
is.
here.
It's far enough behind us. That was a good move to get that away from the
Yeah.
village itself. But yeah, we've got 400 acres here that sort of protects us. I mean, I wish it were 4,000, but
Yeah.
but it's
That's a lot to mow, Tommy.
It is a lot to mow, and we have enough to mow. But
Yeah.
that 400 acres shields us from encroachment to a great degree, and we're very fortunate to have that.
Yeah, because other than having the Fathers of Mercy next door, and I'm guessing they're not too rowdy, so
They are the absolute perfect neighbors.
great neighbors, yeah, and but you're right off the main highway.
We are.
I mean, it's only what, a mile to get back here? Is it even that?
It's not even a mile from 6880, which is 4-lane,
Yeah.
and then we're 10 miles west of Bowling Green. So
Yeah.
we're sort of out in the country, but really not. It doesn't take very long to get
No,
here from Bowling Green.
It didn't take me long driving. I live in downtown Bowling Green, and I was here in practically no time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, good.
Easy to find, and so. Well, Tommy, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time, and yeah, we'll be back to. I want to come back for the holiday market.
Okay.
Yeah, and check it out, and anything else that's going on. And then when you get the new building, or not new building, but
We'll
get your
finish.
renovations done there, we'll definitely come back
Yes.
and take a look at those.
Okay.
Share that with folks.
Sounds
too.
great.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.